Well, Dale. First of all, thank you for doing this. Appreciate it. We always appreciate
Oh, I am excited to be here.
educating. Let's see. You kind of. Let's see. I don't. We got the top of your head in the view. I don't know if you want to. There you go.
Sit up straight.
Sit up straight. Yeah, it's good posture and all that good stuff. Dale, where are you located? Just out of curiosity.
I am in southeastern Kansas. Um, I am 2 hours southwest of the Kansas City airport.
Okay. And what's SHU? Is that a university somewhere? SHU? I see that on your
Soil
SH
Health University.
Soil Health University.
That got put on there a while back, and I just left it there. It sounds impressive. So,
well, I think it's a good thing to talk about. So, and that's my understanding is, you've got a lot of knowledge around the way we raise animals, and this is very topical because there's a lot of people that would like to see us not raise animals anymore for food.
that's
And I
correct.
think this is something that we need to educate the populace on in a very vocal, and sort of, I would even say, aggressive way. I think the time has come to no longer sit there and silently just watch the world go by because it's starting to impact some things. So tell us a little bit. We got Stephen Swick in here, and he does a great job of introducing me to a lot of folks that are in this space. But one of the things he'd mentioned is you talking about the way that ranchers are discovering that grazing versus feedlot. The traditional system has been, cow calf 6 months, maybe a stocker, or maybe straight to the feedlot for another 6 months, where they get fattened up, and that's becoming even less financially lucrative for the ranchers. And so they're naturally sort of discovering that this better grazing style is what we want to see.
Yeah. Well, it's the human mind changes much slower than conditions change, unfortunately. So many of our thought processes in agriculture were formed during the 1960s, early 70s, when we had cheap fuel, we had cheap labor, we had cheap concrete, we had cheap steel. Everything was cheap because energy, oil, was cheap, and the cost of oil really affects the cost of everything. And so in the 1950s and 60s, the post World War II era, it made complete sense to mechanize everything, because mechanization is very inexpensive when you're dealing with ridiculously cheap oil. And then starting in 74 with the Arab oil embargo, the world changed, but agriculture didn't change with it. We clung to those old ideas that efficiency was about doing everything we could with fossil fuel powered equipment, including putting animals in feedlots. And I want you to think about something. Somewhere in Iowa, there's a farmer who has a pasture full of calves, cows and calves. And in the fall, in October, this fall, he'll wean the calves off the cows and put them on a truck and send them to a feedlot in Garden City, Kansas. Across the fence from that will be a cornfield. Into that cornfield, he will send a $600,000 combine that burns diesel fuel to harvest that. They'll put it on a $100,000 grain cart pulled by a $100,000 tractor that runs on diesel fuel. And it'll move it over to the edge of the field where a semi sits that burns on diesel fuel. It costs $150,000, and it will take it in town to the elevator. Well, they'll dry it with propane, and so it'll safely store. And then throughout the winter, they will put it on a railroad car that costs millions of dollars and burns diesel fuel to take it to Garden City, Kansas, to the same feedlot where the calves went. So it's just ridiculous. we do this because we're efficient. Now I have customers who are simply putting a gate in the fence and harvesting that crop ground with grazing crops to accomplish the exact same purpose, and cutting out the $600,000 combine, the $100,000 grain cart, the $100,000 tractor, the $100,000 semi, the multi-million-dollar train. And all the manure ends up going right back out on the field for the benefit of the next crop and to the soil below it. And that's really a big change, is when you consider yourself, when your thought process changes from my job as a farmer is to raise corn or to raise soybeans or to raise cattle, when that mindset changes to my job is to harvest sunlight, you start to see every photon that hits bare soil as a wasted opportunity. And if you fly over the corn belt, even right now, I mean, today we're supposed to be 80 degrees, and we got moist soil and 80-degree temperatures and nothing green over the vast swaths of landscape. There's not a single thing green. We're not capturing sunlight energy. We're not photosynthesizing. And so one of the biggest changes that's occurring in agriculture right now, very positive change, is the emergence of cover crops and the utilization of those cover crops for grazing. There's all kinds of benefits to cover crops. We've known that. Roman authors, Greek authors, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, were talking about the benefits of cover crops in their writings. So it's something we've known was good for the soil. And one of the big mistakes we made in that post-World War II era was separating animals from cropland. We were putting animals in confinement, removing them from the landscape, and that was, in hindsight, was a huge mistake, because every natural ecosystem, the most successful agriculture systems will mimic nature. They'll follow natural principles instead of trying to fight against nature. And every natural ecosystem has animals, and herbivorous animals that can process high cellulose vegetative material, ferment it inside a rumen or similar fermenting chamber in their digestive system, and process it into meat, milk, manure, and for the benefit of the entire ecosystem. And some ecosystems, particularly grasslands, natural grasslands, are mutually dependent on those grazing herbivores, and they will stagnate and become completely unproductive. And the reason is that in low rainfall areas, that grass vegetation does not naturally nourish decay microbes on a consistent basis. For microbes to work, it has to be warm, so that takes out half the year. It has to be moist, which takes out most of the year in an arid grassland. And it has to be protected from ultraviolet radiation, so that takes out 12 hours of every day. You add all those things up, and it has to be of sufficient protein content, which takes it out completely in a grassland in the wintertime. It's just that residue is very, very low in protein, won't nourish a microbe. However, in a ruminant animal, it can gather that material, put it into a warm, moist, dark fermentation chamber, and 24 hours later do enough fermentation to equal about 2 years worth on the soil surface. Remove that dead vegetation so that the newly emerging shoots of that grass can hit sunlight. and that's the driving force for all of this is sunlight. All soil improvement, all life on Earth essentially derives from sunlight and photosynthesis. So really what you're doing with that ruminant animal is you are maintaining that grassland in a state where it can perform optimum photosynthesis. And when we moved animals into feedlots, we really separated that process away from the grasslands. And the cover crop uh, revolution that's occurring now. You know, our natural grasslands, the reason we came up with feedlots in the first place was because the warm season grasses out here on the plains are summer grasses. They're very high quality in the summer, have no quality in the winter. And so they don't sustain animal gains in the wintertime. They said, well, we'll grow corn and feed them corn in the winter and they'll gain very rapidly. So we grazed in the summer, fed corn in the winter, and then we'd butcher animals when they were fat. And then it evolved because of, you know, all the cheap fuel and everything. It became very profitable to do it on a year-round basis because you can store corn and feed it. You don't have to feed it when it's harvested. You can feed it year-round. So this entire industry sprung up, and then the meat processing industry sprung up around it. So now we have this very highly centralized cattle feeding and cattle processing industry in the arid parts of the high plains. That's where most of our nation's meat is finished and processed. But the grass phase, the grazing phase, occurs everywhere. And with cover crops, what cover crops do, for example, in corn and soybeans grow in the summer. They don't grow in the winter, but you can plant a cover crop in between a corn and soybean crop that can produce very high quality grazing in the wintertime, which we would not otherwise have. And that's on land that's otherwise idle. And the growth of that cover crop nourishes the soil, protects the soil from erosion. It helps provide weed control in the next crop. It builds your soil organic matter so it holds moisture better, creates a mulch to hold moisture better. There are hundreds of benefits to growing these cover crops. The problem has always been, the barrier has been, you need a means to cash flow them. I mean, we know they're great long term, but how do we pay for them now? And the way you pay for them is to graze them. And so by providing that high quality winter grazing in areas where we've only been able to get good animal performance in the summer, and we had to feed grain in the winter to make them gain, now we can make them gain really close to 12 months out of the year on pasture. Not necessarily natural pasture, but these temporary cover crop pastures. And so that makes the production of grass finished beef a very, very viable process now, if you take advantage of those seasonal grazing opportunities afforded by cover crops. And so that's what I've been working with some of these big feedlots is they're finding out. I mean, we are always told that by commodity organizations, I guess I'll call them in agriculture, that our agriculture is the most efficient in the world, and we do things better than anybody, and shut up and eat what we serve you. And that's not the case. Our feedlot system really is not very, it's efficient in terms of one person can feed a lot of animals. It's not very efficient in terms of energy processing or producing the most food per calorie of fossil fuel invested or per unit of sunlight. And it's really not that economical. There's very, very narrow margins in cattle finishing. And the customers I've been working with that I've been putting on grazing programs are telling me that, and I'll put this in perspective, their cost of gain per pound of beef is about 25 cents a pound less on a grazing program than it is on feeding grain and confinement. And they're, of course, everything that these customers I'm working with are in irrigated areas on the high plains where the on the Ogallala aquifer that's rapidly being depleted. And so water consumption is a huge issue there. There's a lot of their center pivot irrigation systems are getting to the point where they can no longer profitably grow corn and cotton, which are historically their major crops in the area. But the water consumption, the irrigation water consumption of these grazing crops that we're putting in is roughly half that needed to grow corn. And if you can cut that irrigation rate in half instead of running out in 20 or 30 years, we can maybe stretch that out for hundreds of years. You know, if we can irrigate the amount that the aquifers typically getting the replenishment rate of the aquifer, if we can match that, then irrigation can continue indefinitely. And irrigation is extremely important to that region. The entire economy and population really depends on that irrigation. It's just we're using it faster than it gets naturally replenished.
Let me just interject here. So, I mean, the commodity folks would say that, hey, look, you know, since 1940, we have, due to, you know, feedlots and so on and so forth, we've reduced our land footprint, we've reduced our water footprint, we've reduced our methane footprint by, you know, 30% or whatever number that they talk about. One of the things they'll say is, you know, these animals are eating all these byproducts of human food consumption. They're eating the hulls and husks. And, you know, how do we sort of transition to this? What's going to happen to all that stuff that we eat as humans? You know, all this soybean husks and corn cobs and so on and so forth. I mean, that just ends up in a landfill and produces all this methane. You know, I mean, I'm trying to think. You know, there's a big picture here. Obviously, what is your perspective on that type of stuff?
Well, I think the industry is going to evolve. You know, when I ask people what's your opposition to feedlots, confined animal agriculture, and I'll talk primarily about beef here because beef is one where we have the most options to do without. Those byproducts can still be fed to animals. I think we should be feeding them to animals. I mean, otherwise, you know, a lot of them would just otherwise go to waste. The rumen is just a true miracle of nature. The rumen, the microbes within that rumen. I mean, a lot of people don't understand. Cows don't actually eat grass. Cows ingest grass. Microbes eat the grass, and then the cow eats microbes. A cow is a microvore, you know, not actually a herbivore. But the miracle of that rumen allows cattle to utilize all kinds of byproducts that are completely inedible to us. And we should be using, I mean, that should be the role of livestock, is to use things that we cannot nutritionally and convert them into products we can eat that are, I mean, I don't have to tell the crowd here how nutritious, you know, meat animal products are. They're incredibly nutritionally dense, and when they're produced from, you know, grasses and pastures, they're even somewhat better than our grain finished animals. As far as the footprint, the footprint of feedlot beef depends largely on how the corn was produced. was the corn produced with tillage, or was it produced no till? Because soil tillage oxidizes soil carbon, and up into the atmosphere it goes. Was the corn produced with cover crops or not? Okay, so cover crops can add carbon to the soil, whereas fallow in between those crops results in a loss of soil carbon during cropping. How was the manure managed? Is it hauled back to the land at an agronomically appropriate rate, or is it just dumped on the closest piece of land to get rid of it? Those are all things. And then maybe, so is the opposition to the feedlot, is it because we're feeding ruminants grain that could be used for human food? Is the opposition because of the confinement? Some people think that confinement is inhumane. Some people think that confinement of those animals is just not ecologically sound. So we can still feed animals. Let's say you are opposed to the confinement of the animals, but you're okay with feeding them grain. We can feed grain out on pasture. I mean, prior to really 1950 or so, most of the animals fed grain were fed grain out on pasture. That way, manure disposal is automatic. You don't have to go out there and scrape it up and put it in a spreader and haul it for miles to get rid of it. It's used right there on the pasture where it's deposited. And I'm working with some people to resurrect that practice, because number one, they can derive part of their nutrition from the pasture itself, and the manure enriches the pasture. And so instead of becoming a disposal problem, it's returned back as an asset like it should be in a natural agroecosystem. And then the other thing is we can still, one of the greatest reasons the feedlot system still exists, even because of its inherent inefficiencies, is because the processing industry, the marketing industry, all grew up around those feedlots. If you're going to have a beef processing plant, why not have it next to a mega feedlot that produces 500,000 animals a year, roughly 1,000 animals every day? Or that makes complete sense. All you got to do is go across the road to get the animals you need for processing. That's completely logical if you are a meat processor. And so the problem with that is if you are Dale Strickler here on your little ranch in southeast Kansas, and you're 500 miles away from the nearest meat processor, and you're raising grass-finished beef, how do you sell that? You can't sell those animals with one phone call. It's essentially a full-time marketing job to call people, would you like to buy one animal or a quarter of an animal? And you might have to call 10 people to get one animal sold. And so it becomes the marketing aspect of some of the things I'm talking about. It's relatively inefficient and time consuming. You can't just, farmers like loading up an entire trailer load of animals and sell them all at once, and then they're done. And they don't like marketing. They like driving tractors and riding around on a horse out in the pasture. And I'm the same way. I don't like marketing. And the way the industry evolved, marketing was really taken off our plates. And the changes I'm talking about a lot of times do not fit into the current marketing system. And that's a big barrier. Now, some things are changing, just like what we're doing now. I mean, the social media has made marketing of for small individuals much, much easier. I think we're going to see a real revolution because of social media and electronic communication, the ability for anybody to market out of their, backyard or living room or kitchen table, whatever you want to market. I think we're going to see a real revolution. But I've been very encouraged, though, that the biggest interest in the sort of things we're doing, extending that grazing period, has been with existing feedlots, and they're doing it as a cost-saving measure, rather than getting, an animal that's a year old and putting it in the feedlot for 6 months. They'll take that same animal and put it into a grazing program for 4 to 6 months, and they're only in the feedlot for 1 or 2 months. Just once an animal gets so heavy, gets very close to that finishing stage, it requires the amount of energy intake it needs just increases exponentially. And it's difficult to do that last little bit on grass. And so that's where they've found that if they're going to feed grain, their dollars are best spent feeding it just at the very tail end of that period. Now, that doesn't help the nutritional value of the meat. If you're a believer in the nutritional value of grass-finished beef, that doesn't help in that regard at all. But it does help the economics of the situation, and obviously the environmental impact of the situation.
You're still, I mean, with that, you're still tied to the Midwest. I hear like ranchers up in Montana, they got to ship 1,000 miles. The transporters are, they're having a hard time because there's laws saying they have to stop every 10 hours, and the animals are and it's dangerous for the animals. And I know they've pushed back, and I think there's a law that's been changed on that. But so you still have this centralized finishing system in the Midwest, Kansas, Nebraska, yes, Oklahoma, and so on and so forth. And so when you're talking about, the cover crops, can that be done in Oregon, Montana, South Dakota, Alberta, Canada? I mean, is that something that can be done pretty much anywhere?
Yes, absolutely. And the Intermountain region, really one of the difficult times to grass finish animals is in the heat of summer over a lot of the U.S. The southern high plains where a lot of the feedlots are, animal gains just crash in July and August in West Texas, for example. Very difficult to maintain good animal gains, especially on pasture. So, but because of the heat, 110 Fahrenheit does not make for good grass finishing conditions on a ruminant, because that ruminant has a big fermentation chamber generating heat 24 hours a day, and puts a tremendous amount of heat load on that animal. Their comfortable body temperature, or their comfortable temperature, exterior temperature, is 20 to 30 degrees lower than ours at any given time. So 110 to them feels like 140 to us. It is brutal on those animals. But if you can move those animals to the mountains in Wyoming during the summer, they can gain where it's 80 degrees instead of 110. Their gains can be tremendous during a period when the rest of the country is experiencing severe heat stress. And I'm working with some people who, like one of my customers is a potato grower. Potatoes are hard on the soil because they involve a lot of digging and tillage, and nothing wrong with the potato plant. It's the harvesting of the potatoes is very hard on soil because of all the tillage. So he has a grazing program in alternate years with the potatoes within the crop rotation, he'll plant summer grazing crops and basically turn it all into manure to restore that soil productivity and the biology in the soil and the structure in the soil. Very, very effective. And he can get tremendous summer gains, actually better gains in a grazing situation than a Texas feedlot can make during that same time period. And said, what a natural, one problem with grass finishing is that it tends to be very seasonal. Here in Kansas, we can get our best gains on pasture in May and June on our warm season native grasses. May, June, July, we can kick out tremendous gains, and then the rest of the year it's very mediocre. So on just natural grass alone, we would be able to market grass finished animals one time a year. If you go to different, other regions, if you go to California, they have winter annual grasses, and their optimum time is basically right now, when their cool season grasses are hitting their peak. And in about a month, that quality is going to tank, and then it'll dry up. So different regions of the country have different times when they would be able to grass finish, and people don't want to buy a year's worth of beef at one time and store it. They want to be able to go to the store once a week and get a week's worth of beef, and that doesn't fit the seasonality of grass finishing. So finding some of these methods to where we can use the cropland and the cover crops to create a 12-month out of the year high quality pasture system. That's what I've been working with in the past. And it's been a lot of fun. It's solved a lot of issues for people.
Let's talk a little bit about, because you're talking about efficiency and producing the product, and one of the concerns is, can you produce enough animals to feed the demand, either domestically or even internationally, with these other methods? And that's one of the criticisms is, there's a lot of people to feed in America. We produce the most beef in the world. I mean, we're the most efficient nation in the world for producing beef, even though we don't have the most cattle. I mean, you look at Brazil has the most cattle, but we still outproduce them with our, breeding programs and livestock management and nutrition and so on and so forth. And then the other thing, obviously, is, the big concern now is sustainability. All Americans need to cut back meat by X amount, so the world doesn't, burn itself to death. What are your thoughts on, these methods for both environmental sustainability issues and then actually being able to produce enough food to feed people?
Okay, let's address the produce the food. Okay, when I drive through the country, all I see, like I said, all of agriculture is about converting sunlight into something useful. And we're just not doing that we like to pound our chest and say we're the most efficient in the world. All I see around me is complete inefficiency. And everywhere I go in the country, it's not that we're less intelligent in Kansas than everywhere else. Everywhere I go in the country, I see photons hitting bare ground. And there is so much. We are barely scratching the potential of what we could do. And let's start with perennial grasslands. Perennial grasslands, if the role of that pasture is to capture sunlight and convert it into more grass, how do you do that when the grass is only this tall? Most of our pastures are in a very degraded state because they're simply not managed. Cowboys want to get on a horse and chase cows around. They don't want to move little electric fences. But if we could convert more people, and the message is getting out, this is happening, but slower than what I would like, through managed grazing systems. And I've seen it. I visited in Africa, where a lot of these ideas originated. visited a rancher, a farmer in South Africa. He was taking it to a real extreme, this managed grazing. He was moving a fence 6 times a day. Now, labor over there is ridiculously cheap, so you can afford to do this. Hire someone who does nothing but move these fences throughout the day. Give them just a small amount, they eat it, then they move. And so everything is grazed at the proper stage, that according to the production goals, and leaving the correct stubble height, so that when you leave that paddock, you still have an intact solar panel there. The amount of efficiency in grazing, when you move those little fences, it's like putting a steering wheel and brakes on a grain combine. You wouldn't ever think about trying to combine a cornfield without a steering wheel and brakes, but that's the way we've grazed our pastures for centuries. And it really causes now, before we had barbed wire and fencing materials, the animals migrated, so they'd graze it down and then move on, and then when they'd come back, it'd be recovered. Or at least that's the theory, the idea. But now that we started confining animals and limited that migratory activity, they just keep beating that pasture up. When you can move those cattle around in a planned method based on the needs of that grass for stubble height and recovery periods, if you understand how the grass works and manage accordingly, the gentleman in Africa who was moving his fence 6 times a day, when you look over across the property line, across the barbed wire fence at the neighbors, you see basically grass this tall with clumps of Aragrostis grass. It's an African love grass. Nothing wants to eat it. Their pastures are pure. The only thing left alive is the love grass that nothing likes. But when they moved to this different grazing system, the grasses they thought were extinct, the desirable grasses, the paspalum and what they call rui grass, African red grass, becomes the dominant species. And this gentleman's pastures, because of his grazing method, the grasses were shoulder tall, so thick that you couldn't walk in there. You couldn't place your foot squarely on the ground because there were so many grass stems coming up. And he was running 5 times the number of cattle per acre as his neighbor with the destroyed pastures. So the conventional wisdom says if you got overgrazed pastures, you need to get rid of the animals. That's not what I've seen. It's a changing of the management that's necessary. I've seen animals that were completely destroyed. Oh, and they had huge acreages and they had 2 horses, and horses just annihilate it because they go wherever they want, whenever they want. And they'll destroy an area and then they'll move on and destroy another area. It's up to us. We can generate so much more grazing from our perennial grasslands if they were appropriately managed. And there's an increasing number of people, largely due to sharing information on social media now, that are doing so. And it is absolutely eye-popping, the results. The second thing is the wasted potential of bare ground on crop ground during so much of the year. Right here where my office is, we are right next to the Neosho River. And the Neosho River Valley is the most productive soil in this area of Kansas. Extremely productive. Similar to what you'd find in Iowa, northern Illinois, southern Minnesota. Very similar to those corn belt soils. Deep, black, rich, fertile. And I've seen a satellite photo of the days of photosynthesis out of the year. It was 90. There's 365 days a year, and we average 90 days of photosynthesis on the richest soil in the area. That's an incredible waste of potential. If those areas were cover crop during what we call the off season and then used for winter grazing, number one, that does that soil a lot of good. The water flowing over the dam over here outside my office might look like water instead of chocolate milk. And it wouldn't be full of phosphate, and it wouldn't be full of nitrate, it wouldn't be full of sediment. It would be clean like it was 150 years ago before all this got plowed up. So not only would we get clean water and a sustained flow instead of drought, flood, because the water goes where it falls, slowly trickles out through springs and seeps instead of running off quickly and flooding. But we would be able to graze our cattle instead of feeding hay, instead of feeding calves, sending calves to the feedlot at weaning. We could grow those calves an extra 6 months on sunlight that was formerly being wasted. And only about 10% of our nation's crop ground is cover cropped. That means 90% of the 440 million acres could be growing winter off-season pasture to basically get those animals, even if they're not grass finished, we could vastly reduce the amount of time that they spend in the feedlot before they hit our table. So if you look at just the rotational grazing, proper grazing management can, I think, at the minimum double the amount of beef we could produce off our perennial pastures. If you take, let's see, 90% of 440, what is that? That's 300, almost 400, 396 million acres of winter grazing, off-season grazing that we could be generating beef from. We haven't scratched our potential. You know, anybody who thinks that producing grass-finished beef or even just shortening that feedlot period doesn't really understand the inefficiencies of agriculture and how agriculture works. We aren't close to scratching our potential. Tremendous potential left out there.
That's, I've interviewed, you're probably familiar with Alan Williams. I've interviewed him a
Yes.
couple of times, and he, similar talks about that, we could easily dramatically increase the amount of beef we could raise and do it sustainably. And the one thing that's important to say is, you put carbon back in the soil, and this is one of the talking points is, what's going on with atmospheric carbon versus soil sequestration. So we could offset, not only agriculture, but many of the other industries by putting more animals in the soil. I was interestingly, you talk about electric fencing. I was just out this weekend at a fellow by the name of Frank Fitzpatrick's ranch up in Orange County, and he actually has collars. They're a little, instead of electric fences, he has collars, and so there's a solar emitter that draws an electronic line, and when the cows get close, a little sound goes off, and if they keep going farther, they'll get a little electrical shock, like an electric fence, without having to move the fences around. All he has to do is use an app, and so he just draws on an app, and he doesn't have to drive around moving fences around. And so that even further makes it easier, I think. Probably more efficiencies with this.
That would remove my favorite part of the day, though, going out and moving those fences. It truly is. Everybody thinks it's just mind-numbing drudgery or something, but the people who do it, we thoroughly enjoy it. It is really just a very pleasant experience to go out there. It doesn't take long, and hold on here just a second. I'm going to find a picture here and show you the work environment I had. Can I share my screen here?
Yes, I just enabled that, so you should be able to do that.
Okay. I got to show you this. This is, let's see, screen one. See, I want screen two, and Tell me if this works. Can you see that?
Nope, not yet. You might have to hit share screen. If you go in the bottom of the app, it says share screen.
Okay,
Scroll
hold
down.
on. Oh, got it.
And then click on maybe your desktop or something like that, and it'll allow you to share whatever you want on your desktop.
Yeah. Okay, now let's try this. Now can you see it?
Still cannot see it, unfortunately.
Ah, how frustrating. I'm usually
There we go.
okay.
There we
Now
go.
let's try this. Okay, now can you see that?
Yeah, we can see the cows in the field.
Okay, that is one of the pastures that this is. I don't actually have this pasture anymore. This is one that I had to sell after my divorce, but this is a pasture that was originally cropland. So this is basically a restored prairie of, was originally low productive crop ground, and it was planted to this restored prairie mix, mostly eastern gamma grass, but I have a few. I had 30 species of native wildflowers in there, plus alfalfa, chicory, a few other grasses, cup plant, Maximilian sunflower. And I want to show you what, this to me is just wonderful part of my day. Just going out there and moving that fence. The amount of wildlife I saw out there, I got to show you, scroll through here. First of all, I want to show you the impact of this on soil. This is a look at my subsoil. I dug a trench in the ground, looked at the subsoil. The arrow there shows, 18-inch depth. That was when I started this process. That was as deep as my roots went. And gray is a lack of oxygen, is indicated by a lack of oxygen in the soil, or indicates a lack of oxygen in the soil. The iron compounds go reduced. You get this gray color, and you see there's no soil structure. It looks like Play-Doh. And so I planted this eastern gamma grass mix. This is a year later. You can see all these little dark streaks. This is organic matter, carbon being deposited in the soil. And this is 3 years later. Quite a little difference there in soil. This is how you build soil. Roots and ruminants.
And that's all. And that's organic, and that's carbon too. That's something people have to understand.
That is, and those roots, I had to sweet talk the backhoe operators, but not supposed to dig deeper than 6 feet without stair stepping it down and so forth. And there's some rules they're supposed to follow. I sweet talked them into making one scoop deeper. We went 9 feet, and there were still roots in abundance at 9 feet deep. And the soil testing on this, we were showing 4 times the microbial biomass in this field than in a very well managed corn soybean field right next to it. 4 times the microbial biomass. That all turns into carbon. And then I wanted to show you something else. This is, hold on. This is in Australia. I talked about potential. Australia has warm season native grasses, much like the Great Plains, don't grow in the winter. This is Colin Seiss's place. He drilled winter oats into his warm season grasses at dormancy. You can see the warm season grass residue sticking up. And then the next year, he combined those oats. And then you can see the pasture grass starting to come up. He raised a grain crop and a pasture crop off the same field in the same year. And this is what it did to the soil carbon. His place is over here on the left, and this is across the fence. Look how much more carbon, how much more soil structure there is where he added that winter grain crop grown in an existing native grassland. So he's producing a human food crop and a pasture crop, same acre, same year. The efficiency on this is just mind-numbingly superior to what we've seen in the past. We've always assumed these native grasslands were the pinnacle of carbon sequestration, and even those can be improved on. And I've got customers who are doing the same practice, except they're grazing the winter cereal, just grazing it off instead of harvesting it for grain, because they want to convert as much as they can into manure. There's no shortage of practices that we're just starting to adopt on a very limited scale that can drastically improve our ability to produce grass finished beef at scale and improve the environmental footprint of that beef production by a wide margin.
Bill, let me just a prediction of what, say a typical acre of land or a 100-acre plot of land. You run crops, cover crops. You have grazing crops. You have cereal crops. You have cows, and you also run vertical stacked multiple animals through the same pasture. I mean, what does a yield look like relative to what it is the typical yield today? I mean, what is it? What is the number X more food you could produce and also be environmentally sustainable, both animal and plant agriculture? What would you estimate?
Nationwide right now, we're at about, it's hard to get accurate numbers because it's not something that's reported on National Ag Statistics Service surveys. But it's estimated that we average about 50 pounds of, if you take the pasture acreage and the beef acreage or beef production and take away the feedlot phase, it's estimated we produce about 50 pounds of beef per acre, which is miserably low. And that's, should be a bit of an embarrassment for us. Because we have so much more potential. And I've gone through scenarios where say, well, if we did this, we could increase this percent. And if we did this extra tip, we can increase this percent, and those sort of things. But the world record, now, not many people record this, but the record beef production per acre that was recorded was just shy of a ton of beef per acre done in Kentucky in the 1980s. And that was with managed grazing, highly improved pastures. And that was with 1980s technology. I mean, this practice, this is the guy I told you about in Africa. This practice was not used in that. I mean, we have so much more potential. On my operation, I was producing about 600 pounds of beef per acre, which is great. I mean, that's 12 times the national average. That seems pretty impressive, but it's nothing compared to a ton. And I don't think a ton per acre is out of the realm of possibility at all. I mean, obviously it's been approached. It was 1,870 pounds of beef per acre, something like that. And you look at the nutrition per amount, the nutritional density of beef compared to grain crops or whatever, the amount of protein pulled off that acre is just staggering. And the ability to do it in a completely soil building, environmentally sustainable manner just blows my mind. It really is impressive.
So the sort of the argument that we don't have enough land, we hear often from sort of animal rights advocates or vegan advocates, is not accurate.
Um, we, if you extrapolate, it's easy. If you extrapolate from data that you don't understand, then it's easy to see how you would come to that conclusion. Say, well, okay, it takes, you know, we're getting 50 pounds of beef per acre of pasture, but within that figure, you know, in New Mexico and 8-inch range land, 8-inch rainfall range land, it might take 250 acres to raise one cow calf pair for the grazing season. 250 acres. But you're not going to convert that land into lettuce production and produce human food any other possible way. I mean, what else are you going to do to derive human food from that? Go hand harvest mesquite pods, cactus fruits? I mean, there is no large scale way to generate food from those arid acres in any other fashion. And that incredible low productive ground gets lumped in with the high productive pasture acres um, to arrive at those statistics. And most of the area used for pasture, um, this picture here with all these animals all in this bunch, um, there were boulders out there that you had to pick and choose where you could drive a pickup because there were boulders sticking up 4 or 5 feet out of the ground. There is no possible way this land could be used to grow crops. I mean, you would destroy a lot, you know, millions of dollars worth of equipment would be destroyed every year. It's not feasible, but it's good soil, good rainfall, just can't be cropped. What else are you going to do this to produce food? This is its highest and best use. And under this management system, like I said, he's producing 5 times the amount of beef per acre as his neighbor and improving his pastures simultaneously. And the wildlife on this, I mean, you can see some of the birds over here and the guinea fowl were just up here where right in front of these animals, loaded with guinea fowl. Every time they move that fence, boom, they scatter. The wildlife populations you can sustain. When people say, oh, you know, it takes this many acres to raise beef, and if we got rid of beef, those acres would be free for wildlife habitat. Well, what's this stuff? What do you call this grassland? That's wildlife habitat. If you cannot make money from this grassland, what happens to a unit of land that is not profitable for the landowner? It's converted to some use that is profitable, whether that's housing subdivisions or crops or whatever. But these ruminant animals, by turning this grassland into money, keep that grassland intact to serve as wildlife habitat. And the grasslands of Africa are some of the most productive wildlife habitat in the world. And unfortunately, a lot of it is in this perpetual overgrazed state with clumps of Aragrostis sticking up that nothing wants to eat. Under this high level of management, this grass is in a incredibly beneficial state for wildlife. It's a beautiful thing to behold. I mean, you heard the theme as I was walking around out here. The theme from The Lion King was playing through my head. So really a neat situation. Um, and later that night, I had one of the I guess you think of highlights of your life as you start getting older. One of the highlights of my life was when they had this braai, big barbecue at the end of the day, and it's dark, and we've got a bonfire going out in the middle of this pasture, and they serve filet mignons on the barbecue grill, and like just doesn't get any better than this. And just like when I was a kid and we had our pasture parties in my little small town in Kansas, all the pickups were backed up in a circle. The tailgates were down. Everybody was sitting on their tailgates, and they had the truck radio playing. And all these guys in their thick Afrikaner accents were bellowing at the top of their lungs, singing along with Sweet Home Alabama on the pickup radios. I just thought, this is how life ought to be lived.
That's a great sentiment there, Dale. Unfortunately, I have to run. This has been wonderful, Dale. Can you tell us where to find more Soil Health University, more information? And we'd love to have you back to dig deeper into this stuff. But where do people go to find out about your work and your information?
Check out Green Cover Seed website, just greencoverseed.com. And all my contact information is on there, my email, cell phone, wealth of information on our website, and we have a YouTube channel as well. Just go to YouTube and look up Green Cover Seed. We've got hundreds of videos, from little 1-minute clips to hour-long presentations.
Okay, thank you so much again for spending time, folks. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
We got a lot of people that got educated, and we got to keep getting this message out. So thanks for what you do. All right, folks.
Thank you. Thank you for what you do.
Sure thing. My pleasure. And like I said, you guys feed me and I'm happy to eat it, but it's a two-way street. All right, guys, we'll see everybody tomorrow. Take care now. Bye-bye.